Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the Ricky McCormick mystery. Imagine, if you will, the heavy, languid air of a Missouri summer. It is the end of June, in the year 1999. The sun hangs low and swollen in the sky, a deep and burning amber that casts long, distorted shadows across the rolling landscape of St. Charles County. Here, the humidity is not just a feeling, it is a weight. It settles over the skin like a damp veil, warm and persistent, carrying with it the scent of river mud, dry grass, and the ripening sweetness of vast, emerald-green cornfields. The world feels slow, as if the very atoms of the air are moving through honey. In this quiet corner of West Alton, the only music is the rhythmic, hypnotic drone of cicadas, a shimmering wall of sound that rises and falls with the heat. It is a place of profound stillness, where the horizon stretches out in shades of gold and green, and the frantic pace of the city feels a lifetime away. Along a quiet field road, just a short distance from the gray ribbon of Highway 367, the silence of the afternoon was about to be broken. It was Wednesday, June 30th. The tall stalks of corn, standing like a silent, leafy army, rustled softly as a gentle breeze stirred the stagnant air. A woman was driving nearby, her vehicle kicking up small, lazy clouds of dust that lingered in the sunlight. Perhaps she was lost, or perhaps she simply enjoyed the solitude of the rural routes that wind through the floodplain where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers converge. As her gaze drifted across the uniform rows of the field, she noticed something. It was a shape that did not belong to the natural geometry of the crops. It was a break in the pattern, a patch of something pale and still tucked deep within the shadows of the stalks. She slowed her car, the engine's hum falling away to a low idle, until the only sound left was the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant, lonely call of a crow. She stepped out of her car, the heat pressing against her immediately. Her footsteps were soft as she approached the edge of the field, the dry earth crunching ever so slightly beneath her shoes. As she peered into the dense green, the reality of what she had seen began to take shape. Lying face down in the dirt, partially hidden by the towering corn, was a man. He was motionless, his body surrendered to the earth. He wore simple, functional clothing, a pair of dark blue jeans, stained and worn, and a white t-shirt that had lost its brightness to the elements. There was an overwhelming sense of isolation in the scene, a feeling that this man had been resting here undiscovered, while the world moved on beyond the highway. The woman didn't need to get closer to know that the life had long since departed from the figure in the field. She retreated to the safety of her car, her heart drumming a steady, hollow rhythm against her ribs, and reached for her phone to call for help. When the authorities arrived at 12:45 in the afternoon, they found a crime scene that was as baffling as it was somber. The St. Charles County Sheriff's Department navigated the narrow rows of corn, their boots pressing into the soft, sun-baked soil. The heat was punishing now, radiating off the ground in shimmering waves that blurred the distance. As they approached the body, the investigators were met with the harsh reality of nature's progress. The man had been there for several days, and the intense Missouri sun had accelerated the process of decomposition. His skin had taken on the colors of the earth, and the environment had begun to reclaim him. He lay with his arms outstretched, as if reaching for something just out of grasp. The state of the remains was so advanced that his fingertips had begun to detach, settling into the weeds and dirt beside his hands. It was a sight that demanded a deep, respectful silence from the men in uniform, a recognition of a life ended in a place where only the wind and the corn could bear witness. There was no identification found on the body. No wallet, no keys, no driver's license to tell the story of who this man was or how he had come to be in a remote field in West Alton. The investigators carefully searched the pockets of his Lee blue jeans, and it was there that they discovered the first true enigmas of the case. Tucked away were two pieces of paper, folded and worn, covered in a dense, chaotic script. But we will let those papers rest for a moment, as the immediate priority was to give the man back his name. Through the painstaking work of the medical examiner and the use of fingerprints, a name finally emerged from the silence. The man was Ricky McCormick. He was 41 years old, a son, a father, and a resident of St. Louis. He was a man who had struggled with his health, suffering from chronic heart and lung conditions that often left him short of breath. But as his identity was confirmed, a new layer of confusion settled over the investigation. Ricky McCormick lived approximately 15 to 20 miles away in a neighborhood on Chateau Avenue. He did not own a car. He did not have a driver's license. The location where he was found was not served by any form of public transportation. There were no bus stops for miles, no train tracks that could have carried him to this rural outskirts. To reach this specific cornfield on foot would have required a journey of many hours, a physical feat that seemed impossible for a man with his documented health struggles. No one had seen him leave his home. No one had reported him missing. He had last been seen alive 5 days earlier, on June 25th, at a hospital in St. Louis for a routine checkup. How did a man with no means of transport and a fragile heart end up face down in a field of corn, miles from the city streets he called home? As the sun set on that first day of the investigation, the golden light faded into a bruised purple, leaving the cornfield in total darkness, and the mystery of Ricky McCormick began to deepen. The air in St. Louis during the summer of 1999 was not merely air. It was a weight, a damp and clinging presence that settled into the deep red pores of the city's brick buildings. On Chateau Avenue, the humidity seemed to pool in the shadows, smelling of hot asphalt, exhaust, and the faint, sweet rot of the river. Ricky McCormick was 41 years old that summer, a man whose physical presence was as fragile as the fading, yellowed wallpaper in a forgotten hallway. He lived in the shadows of the city's industry, often staying with his elderly mother or drifting between the homes of various family members. His world was small, bounded by the cracked sidewalks and the familiar hum of the neighborhood. Across from where he lived stood an Amoco gas station, a place of bright fluorescent lights and the constant, rhythmic chime of the door sensor. It was a mundane landscape, one where Ricky was a known fixture, a quiet man who moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his shoulders often hunched as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible in a world that felt too heavy for him. To look at Ricky was to see a man in a constant struggle with his own biology. His body was a landscape of chronic ailments, his heart and lungs locked in a weary battle that left him frequently gasping for air. Every breath he took was a conscious effort, a shallow pull of oxygen that felt like drawing thick velvet into his chest. He suffered from high blood pressure and debilitating asthma, conditions that were only exacerbated by his habit of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day since the age of 10 and drinking coffee by the gallon. He was a man on disability, his health too precarious for steady, rigorous labor, yet he found small ways to keep moving. He had a history of bouncing between low-wage jobs, sometimes working the night shift as a dishwasher or a busboy, preferring the cool, silent hours when the world was asleep and the demands on his tired lungs were fewer. In the weeks leading up to that final June, he had been a frequent visitor to the emergency room, seeking relief from the tightness in his chest and the sharp, stabbing pains that reminded him of his own mortality. He was a man who knew the inside of Forest Park Hospital better than the sprawling parks that gave the city its name. There was a quality to Ricky that his family struggled to name, a distance in his eyes that suggested he was always looking at something just beyond the horizon of the visible world. His cousin Charles once remarked that Ricky often talked as if he were in another world, a place where the harsh realities of poverty and illness did not reach him. A psychiatrist who once evaluated him described a brick wall in his mind, a barrier Ricky refused to break down. He was a storyteller, a man with an active imagination who spun tall tales to fill the silence of his reclusive life. Though he had dropped out of high school and was often described as functionally illiterate, he possessed a secret, internal language. He was known to carry small, battered notebooks or scraps of paper, filling them with what his family called chicken scratch, rows of symbols and letters that made sense only to him. To the outside world, he was a simple man, perhaps even slow, but in the private theater of his notebooks, he was a record keeper of things unknown. He would sit for hours, his head bowed, his pen moving in frantic, jagged lines, creating a coded map of a mind that no one else was invited to enter. This reclusive, physically frail man lived a life of strict routine, dictated by the lack of a vehicle and the limits of his own endurance. Ricky did not own a car. He did not have a driver's license. The complex mechanics of operating a vehicle were as foreign to him as the distant cities he never visited. When he needed to travel, he relied on the steady, lumbering rhythm of the St. Louis bus system. He knew the schedules, the wait times at the benches under the blazing sun, and the familiar faces of the drivers who hummed along their routes. He was a man of the pavement and the public transit line. Yet the mystery that haunts his memory begins with a distance that his feet and the city buses could not bridge. West Alton, where his body was eventually discovered, lay 15 to 20 miles away from his home on Chowdo Avenue. It was a rural expanse of cornfields and narrow roads, far beyond the reach of the city's bus lines and the familiar safety of the neighborhood streets. For a man who struggled to walk a few blocks without pause, a journey of 15 miles was an impossible trek. The geography of his final days is a puzzle of jagged edges. On June 25, 1999, he was seen at Forest Park Hospital for a checkup, a routine interaction with the medical world he depended on. After leaving the hospital, he visited his Aunt Gloria, a woman he shared a deep bond with, someone he trusted with the quiet fragments of his life. They sat together in the late afternoon heat, the light turning a dusty gold as it filtered through the windows. He stayed for about an hour, chatting about nothing in particular, his presence calm but his departure final. When he rose to leave, he declined an offer for a ride, waving it off with a casual gesture before disappearing into the humid evening. This was a man who lived a life of small, predictable movements. Yet somehow, in the 5 days that followed, he crossed the threshold from the urban center to a desolate field in St. Charles County. There were no witnesses to his journey, no sightings of him on a bus heading north, no reports of him hitchhiking along the highway. He simply vanished from the grid of his known life, leaving behind the elderly mother who waited for him and the children he had fathered, drifting toward a place where the corn grows tall and the silence is absolute. Consider the image of Ricky in those final moments. A man whose heart beat with a fragile, irregular rhythm, standing at the edge of a vast, green sea of corn. The stalks would have been high in late June, rustling in the hot breeze like 1,000 dry whispers. The ground beneath his feet was not the solid concrete of Chowdo Avenue, but the soft, unforgiving earth of a floodplain. He was miles from the nearest bus stop, miles from the gas station where he worked, and miles from the medical help he so frequently required. How does a man who cannot drive and can barely breathe reach such a lonely destination? The discrepancy between his physical limitations and the location of his body suggests a hidden chapter, a silent transport that occurred in the dark. As he moved toward that field, did he carry the 2 pieces of paper already tucked into his pockets, or were they written in the frantic, final hours of his life? The man from St. Louis was a ghost even before he died, a shadow moving through a city that barely noticed him, until he was found in a place he never should have been, leaving the world to wonder what secrets were buried with him in the dirt. The transition from the wild, swaying gold of the Missouri cornfield to the sterile, echoing silence of the morgue was a shift from one kind of mystery to another. In the field, there had been the scent of ripening earth and the dry rustle of stalks in the summer breeze. But here, The air was cold and clinical, heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of disinfectant and the low, constant hum of industrial refrigeration. Ricky McCormick now lay upon a stainless steel table, a stark contrast to the soft, chaotic bed of weeds where he had spent his final days under the open sky. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a flickering, sickly energy, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Outside those walls, the world of 1999 continued its frantic pace, unaware of the deep, heavy silence that had settled over this one life. The medical examiner moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, the soft squeak of rubber soles on the polished tile floor the only sound in the room. There is a specific kind of quiet that accompanies an autopsy where there are no clear answers, a heavy, expectant stillness that waits for the body to speak its final truths. By the time Ricky reached this cold metal table on June 30th, the harsh Missouri summer had already claimed much of the physical evidence. The heat of late June is a relentless thing in the Midwest. It is thick and humid, a heavy blanket that accelerates the natural cycle of the earth. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, a process that had been so rapid and so thorough that it had nearly erased the man's identity. The skin had softened and darkened, taking on the color of the very earth he was found upon. Most hauntingly, the very tools of identification had begun to slip away. The flesh on his hands had degraded to such an extent that his fingertips had detached, found lying among the stalks of corn like fallen petals. To identify him, investigators had to meticulously recover these fragments, using the ridges of his fingerprints to match him to records from an earlier time in his life. It was a slow, grim puzzle, one that required a gentle hand and a patient mind. As the medical examiner looked down at the remains, there was a sense that the story of Ricky's end was being whispered in a language that was increasingly difficult to translate. The examination began with a search for the obvious, for the violent punctuations that usually mark the end of a life found in such a lonely place. The examiner's gloved hands searched for the telltale signs of a struggle, the jagged entry of a bullet, the sharp divide of a blade, or the dark, mottled bruising that speaks of a physical confrontation. But as the hours stretched on, the silence of the body remained unbroken. There were no broken bones to tell of a fall or a fight. There were no metallic fragments lodged in the tissue. Even the neck and throat, often the site of telltale injuries in cases of foul play, offered no clear testimony. While some later documents would hint at the possibility of a wound in that area, the sheer level of decay made it impossible to say with any certainty. The body was a fortress of secrets, its walls reinforced by the very passage of time and the elements. Every inch of the 41-year-old man was scrutinized under the harsh, unforgiving lights, but the physical world seemed to have conspired to keep the truth of his passing hidden beneath a veil of natural erosion. Inside, the story was equally veiled. The examiner looked to Ricky's heart and lungs, knowing from his medical history that these were his points of vulnerability. We know that just days before, on June 22nd and again on June 25th, Ricky had sought help at the hospital, complaining of a chest that felt tight and breath that came in short, panicked gasps. He was a man who lived with the constant shadow of chronic illness, his body a map of old struggles with asthma and heart trouble. The medical examiner could see the wear on his organs, the signs of a life lived with a fragile physical constitution. Yet, even these findings could not provide the definitive answer the police were looking for. Was it possible that the heat and the stress of being in that remote field had simply caused his heart to stop? Or was there something more sinister that left no trace in the softening tissue? The final report would eventually carry a word that is the most frustrating in all of forensics: undetermined. It was a formal admission that the body had kept its silence to the very end, leaving the cause of death as a blank space on an official form. For the detectives of the Major Case Squad, this lack of a cause of death was a wall they could not climb. Their instincts, honed by years of walking the darker streets of St. Louis, told them that men like Ricky McCormick do not simply find themselves 15 miles away from home in a remote cornfield to die of natural causes. Ricky did not own a car. He did not drive. The area near West Alton was not a place reachable by the city buses he relied upon. It was a place of vast, empty horizons and winding two-lane roads, far from the familiar corners of his life on Chateau Avenue. To get there, he would have needed help, or he would have been taken there against his will. The investigation began to stall, the gears of the legal system grinding to a halt without the fuel of physical evidence. The leads that had seemed so promising, the last sightings at the gas station, the whispers of his connections to local drug figures, all began to fade into the background. The file on Ricky McCormick was placed into a drawer, the pages growing crisp as the months turned into years. The silence that had begun on that autopsy table now spread to the investigation itself, leaving the mystery of the man in the cornfield to sleep, undisturbed, for over a decade. The years began to pull away from the summer of 1999 like a slow-moving tide, leaving the case of Ricky McCormick to settle into the quiet, dust-laden shelves of the archives. For 12 years, the world moved on. Seasons turned from the humid, cicada-heavy heat of Missouri summers into the brittle, bone-chilling winters of the Midwest. The cornfield where he was found was harvested, tilled, and replanted a dozen times over. The investigators who had first walked that soil grew older, their hair silvering, their notebooks from that day buried under mountains of newer, louder tragedies. In the silence of the evidence lockers, the cardboard boxes held their breath. Inside one of those boxes, tucked away in the pockets of a pair of heavy blue jeans, lay a secret that the public had no idea existed. The police had mentioned an emergency room ticket, a small scrap of mundane life, but they had whispered nothing of the 2 yellowed, crumpled pages that were folded tightly, holding a language no one could speak. It was a silence that lasted 4,285 days, a decade of hidden ink and unanswered questions. Then came the spring of 2011. The air was crisp, and the digital age had fully dawned, transforming how the world communicated. In March of that year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out from the shadows of the case and dropped a bombshell that reignited the mystery with a fierce, blinding light. They revealed that Ricky McCormick had not just been a man found in a field with health problems. He was the carrier of a deep, impenetrable mystery. In a sterile, white-walled room at the FBI headquarters, where the hum of high-powered servers creates a constant, low-frequency vibration, the elite members of the Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit had reached a breaking point. These were the minds trained to crack the codes of international spies, the encryption of organized crime syndicates, and the complex ciphers of modern terrorists. They sat under the cool glow of fluorescent lights, staring at high-resolution scans of 2 handwritten notes. The paper was worn, the edges slightly frayed, and the ink had bled just enough into the fibers over the years to give the letters a soft, ghostly blur. The first note was a dense thicket of characters. Imagine the smell of old, slightly damp paper and the faint, metallic scent of graphite. There were approximately 30 lines of text, written in a cramped, deliberate hand. Capital letters marched across the page in erratic formations, punctuated by numbers and sudden, puzzling dashes. There were sequences like ALPNTE and GLSC, followed by strings of digits that seemed to hold a rhythmic, hidden meaning. Most hauntingly, there were parentheses, curved lines that hugged certain groups of letters, as if they were secrets within a secret, whispered asides in a language known only to one person. The second note was shorter, but no less baffling. To the untrained eye, it looked like the frantic scribblings of someone trying to remember a list, but to the experts, it was a structured wall. There were patterns, repetitions of the letter E, which often acts as a spacer in complex codes, and recurring clusters like NCBE. The FBI had thrown everything they had at these pages. They used supercomputers that could process millions of permutations a second, and they consulted with the American Cryptogram Association, a group of the world's most dedicated hobbyist decoders. Every single one of them hit a brick wall. The code was not just difficult, it was alien. When the FBI finally showed these notes to the public, the reaction from Ricky's family was one of stunned disbelief and sharp skepticism. Picture his mother, Frankie Sparks, her hands perhaps trembling as she looked at the images on a television screen for the first time. She didn't see the work of a criminal mastermind or a secret agent. She saw what she called chicken scratch. She told reporters with a heavy heart that the only thing Ricky could really write was his name. He was a man who had struggled with the basic structure of language his entire life, a high school dropout who functioned on the margins of literacy. His cousins echoed this, describing his writing as nothing more than meaningless scribbles, a habit he had since he was a small boy. They remembered him sitting quietly, lost in his own world, moving a pen across paper in loops and jumbles that never made sense to anyone else. To the family, the idea that these notes held the key to a murder was almost absurd. They believed the FBI was chasing a ghost, projecting brilliance onto a man who was simply trying to navigate a world that had always felt a little too loud and a little too fast for him. Yet the chief of the FBI's cryptanalysis unit, a man named Dan Olson, disagreed with a quiet, professional intensity. He stood by the belief that the characters were not random. He pointed to the way the lines were justified, the way certain sequences appeared at the beginning of sections, and the consistent use of symbols. In his view, this wasn't the chaotic wandering of a mind that couldn't write. It was a private shorthand, a deeply personal system of communication that Ricky had perfected over decades. The agency believed that if they could only break the first few links of this chain, they would find a map. They believed the notes would tell them where Ricky had been in the 3 days he was missing, who he had met in the shadows of the city, and ultimately, who had ended his life in that lonely cornfield. The secret had been kept for 12 years to protect the integrity of the investigation, but now the desperation was palpable. The FBI was inviting the entire world to look over their shoulders, to stare into the yellowed pages and find the logic hidden in the loops of the ink. They were hoping that somewhere, in the mind of a stranger, there was a key that matched the lock Ricky McCormick had carried to his grave. The light within the hallowed, silent corridors of the FBI's laboratory division in Quantico was always a sterile, flickering white, a stark and clinical contrast to the thick, humid air of the Missouri cornfield, where this investigation first took root. Within the enclave known as the Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, a different kind of war was being waged. It was not a war of bullets or high-speed chases, but a quiet, agonizing battle against the limits of the human mind and the impenetrable nature of the written word. Here, the air was perpetually cool, circulating with a low, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the analysts as they worked. They sat before desks cluttered with high-resolution scans and original documents protected by thin layers of archival plastic, their eyes straining against the glare of their monitors. Among these artifacts lay 2 small scraps of paper, barely larger than the palm of a hand, which had traveled from that lonely field in St. Charles County to this place of digital precision. These were the notes recovered from the pockets of Ricky McCormick's trousers, and to the elite team tasked with deciphering them, they represented a puzzle that felt less like a simple code and more like a haunting, personal taunt from the grave. The notes themselves were deceptively humble. One can almost feel the texture of the paper, cheap, lined notebook pages, perhaps torn in a moment of frantic urgency. They were stained with the ghosts of the environment where they were found, carrying the faint, musty scent of damp earth and the lingering shadows of summer decay. The ink was dark and hurried, the strokes of the pen sometimes pressing deep enough to indent the fibers, suggesting a hand that moved with a singular, driving purpose. Across the 2 pages, 30 lines of complex characters marched in uneven rows. There were clusters of capital letters, seemingly random, yet punctuated by dashes, periods, and curious parentheses that cradled certain strings of text like a secret within a secret. To the untrained eye, it looked like the wandering scribbles of a mind lost in thought. But to Dan Olson and his team of master codebreakers, there was a rhythm there. There was a structure that suggested a rule-based system, a hidden logic that should, by all rights of mathematical probability, eventually yield its secrets to the light of analysis. For 12 long years, the Bureau kept these notes shielded from the public eye, treating them as the primary key to a locked door. The analysts employed every weapon in their vast cryptographic arsenal. They began with frequency analysis, the foundational science of code-breaking that counts how often each character appears. In the English language, the letter E is the most common, and in Ricky's notes, the letter E appeared with a frequency that teased the investigators, acting as a potential spacer or a recurring anchor. They looked for the telltale patterns of a monoalphabetic substitution cipher, where one letter simply stands for another, but the sequences refused to break. They ran the strings through supercomputers, searching for linguistic shifts or known acronyms, yet the machines returned only silence. The analysts would sit for hours in the deepening twilight of their offices, the only sound the soft scratching of pencils on yellow legal pads and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, as they tried to find a crib, a single known word like the, or, and, that could unravel the entire tapestry. But the notes remained stubbornly opaque, a wall of ink that would not crumble. The frustration within the unit grew into a heavy, palpable thing. These were the same minds that had unmasked international spy rings and decoded the communications of sophisticated criminal syndicates. Yet they were being held at bay by the writings of a 41-year-old man who had dropped out of high school and lived a life of quiet struggle. The paradox was maddening. How could someone who was described as functionally illiterate, a man who could barely sign his own name according to his family, produce a cipher that baffled the most brilliant minds in the federal government? The Bureau leaned into the theory that Ricky had been a natural, if untrained, cryptographer, developing his own private language since he was a young boy. They imagined him sitting in the shadows of his small apartment or the noisy corners of the Amoco gas station, meticulously recording his world in a shorthand that only he could interpret. It was a language born of isolation, a mental fortress where his thoughts could reside, safe from a world that had often been unkind to him. As the years stretched into a decade, the investigation hit a final, daunting brick wall. In 2011, the decision was finally made to do something the FBI rarely does. They admitted they were stumped. They released the notes to the world, inviting amateur sleuths and professional linguists alike to peer into the mystery. The response was an immediate tidal wave of theories. Some suggested the notes were a ledger for drug transactions, pointing to Ricky's known associates in the St. Louis underground. Others believed the parentheses indicated map coordinates or timestamps for a meeting that turned fatal. There were even those who wondered if the notes were a medical diary, a frantic attempt by a man suffering from chronic heart and lung ailments to track his failing health. Yet, even with thousands of fresh eyes and new perspectives, the silence remained. Every lead led back to the same place, the quiet, unmoving ink on the page. The elite codebreakers began to realize that the notes might not be a standard cipher at all, but a form of idiosyncratic shorthand, a language of one, which, without the context of the author's unique inner life, might be truly unbreakable. This realization brought a somber weight to the halls of the Bureau. To solve the code was to solve the murder, to finally give a name to the person who had left Ricky McCormick in that field, 15 miles from a home he could not easily reach. But as the pages grew yellow with age, and the digital scans were opened, and closed 1,000 times. A haunting possibility began to linger in the minds of the investigators. If the code was indeed a private language, then the secrets of Ricky's final days were locked inside a mind that was no longer there to speak them. The notes were not just a puzzle. They were a testament to the profound and sometimes tragic privacy of the human experience. They stood as a reminder that some truths are whispered in a voice so low, and in a tongue so personal that they are destined to remain forever in the shadows, just out of reach of even the most determined light. The heat of a Missouri summer is a heavy, physical thing. It does not just sit on the skin. It clings, thick with moisture from the slow, winding rivers nearby. On the afternoon of June 30th, 1999, the air in West Alton was especially stagnant. In a vast cornfield that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of pale green, the only sound was the dry, rhythmic rustle of stalks swaying in a ghost of a breeze. A woman driving along a quiet field road happened to glance toward the rows of corn and saw something that did not belong. There, face down in the dirt, lay the body of Ricky McCormick. He was 41 years old, a man who had lived a quiet, difficult life in the shadows of St. Louis. The cornfield was 15 miles from his home on Chowdo Avenue, a distance that felt like a lifetime for a man who did not own a car and relied on a bus system that did not reach this desolate patch of earth. The scene was one of profound isolation. The ground was hard-packed, the sun was unforgiving, and the silence of the field seemed to swallow the tragedy whole. When the investigators arrived, they found a scene that defied easy explanation. Ricky's body was severely decomposed, the heat having accelerated the natural processes of decay until his very identity was nearly lost to the earth. But tucked deep within the pockets of his filthy blue jeans were 2 scraps of paper that would transform a local tragedy into an international enigma. These were not letters or lists in any traditional sense. They were covered in a dense, chaotic jumble of capital letters, numbers, and carefully placed parentheses. Strings of characters like ALPNTE and NCBE marched across the lined paper in a frantic, purposeful hand. For 12 years, these notes sat in the sterile, climate-controlled evidence lockers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The experts within the Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, men and women who had spent their lives breaking the most complex codes of terrorists and international spies, found themselves defeated by these 2 small sheets of paper. They stared at the graphite marks through magnifying glasses, mapping the frequency of every letter, searching for a pattern in the chaos, but the code refused to speak. The mystery of the notes deepened when investigators looked into the man who carried them. Ricky McCormick had been a high school dropout, a man who struggled with basic literacy. His own family described his writing as little more than chicken scratch, claiming he could barely sign his own name, let alone construct a complex cipher that would baffle the brightest minds in the government. This sparked a haunting question that still lingers in the humid Missouri air. Did Ricky write these notes himself, using a private, secret language he had cultivated since childhood to navigate a world that often overlooked him? Some believe the notes were a diary of sorts, a map of a mind that worked in ways we cannot comprehend. Others point to a darker possibility. They suggest Ricky was a courier, an unwitting messenger for the drug trade, carrying a ledger or a set of instructions that he himself could not read. In this theory, the notes weren't his at all, but a death warrant or a transaction record belonging to dangerous men who saw Ricky as nothing more than a disposable link in a chain. The field in West Alton was a known dumping ground, a place where things and people were left when they were no longer needed. In March of 2011, the Bureau took the unprecedented step of admitting they were at a loss. They released the notes to the public, hoping that a fresh set of eyes or a stroke of amateur brilliance might finally crack the code. Thousands of theories flooded in from around the globe. People analyzed the weather patterns of 1999, the street names of St. Louis, and the medical shorthand of the hospitals Ricky had visited. Yet, despite the collective intelligence of the Internet and the rigorous efforts of the American Cryptogram Association, the meaning of the characters remains locked away. The case of Ricky McCormick has become a legend, a ghost story for the modern age. It is a reminder that even in an era of total surveillance and supercomputers, some secrets are taken to the grave. The field in West Alton is quiet now. The corn is harvested and planted again in an endless cycle, and the wind still whispers through the stalks, carrying the echoes of a story that may never be fully told. The paper is yellowing, the ink is fading, and the man who held the key is long gone. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.